Hey guys, Scott here, and I'm back to share with you some recent vintage action figure pickups, specifically some Hasbro WWF wrestling figures that I got my hands on recently. Now, as we know, this lockdown situation that we're all experiencing at the moment has put a temporary hold on all events, and collector fairs and vintage toy shows are no exception to that. Also, with social distancing being important at the moment, I'm less inclined to connect with other collectors through Facebook Marketplace and meet up and purchase vintage action figures that way. So I'm not really buying a whole lot at the moment. So I figure what I'll do is I'll take the time while I have it to go through recent pickups that I've added to my collection and share those with you through these videos. And today, like I said, we'll look at some vintage Hasbro figures. Now, before we go through these vintage Hasbro WWF figures, I've been a big wrestling fan since 1992. It was during 1992 that I had my first exposure to the WWF. Now, I was with my parents and we visited some friends of ours, and one of the kids in that family happened to be watching the 1992 Royal Rumble. Now, up until that point, I had no exposure to pro wrestling. I didn't know what the WWF was, but that first experience of this 30-man battle royal with larger-than-life cartoon characters almost, like The Undertaker and Jake the Snake Roberts and Sergeant Slaughter and the Warlord and the Berserker, it got me hooked from day one. And from there, I set about watching as much wrestling as I could. And my only way to do that at the time, before the internet, was to go to the video store and to rent videotapes dating back to sort of 1988 and all the way forward to sort of 92, 93, up to 95, 96, when I sort of drifted apart from wrestling at that time. And the characters during the early to mid 90s in the WWF, like I mentioned, were like cartoon characters. They were very gimmick heavy. You know, you had the Repo Man and the Mountie. Now, the toy partner of the WWF at that time was Hasbro. And to me, they delivered a line of action figures that were perfectly representative of the WWF during that time. Just like the wrestlers, these figures were fun, they were cartoony, they weren't perfect representations of the wrestlers themselves, but again, they were caricatures, and they brought out the personality and the spirit of those wrestlers, and I absolutely ate them up. Now, shortly after 1992, I'm thinking probably 1993 at that point in time, I visited some cousins interstate, and one of my cousins had some Hasbro WWF wrestling figures and a ring, and the Hasbro WWF ring to go with. And for me, that was just incredible. At that point in time, my cousin was a little bit older than me, and he was starting to get out of action figures, and my mum and my auntie made a deal, and when I went back home to Sydney after hanging out with my cousins and my auntie and uncle, the Hasbro WWF figures and the ring came with me. And from there, every Christmas, every birthday, all I was asking for was WWF wrestlers to add to my collection, to add to my own Royal Rumbles that I was simulating with these figures. Now, obviously, you know, like all of us, at some point in time, toys and action figures were no longer cool, were no longer fun for me, and I'm pretty sure my whole collection of WWF Hasbro wrestling figures and my ring was given away for a couple of bucks at a garage sale by my mum. But when I started collecting vintage action figures once again and started attending collector fairs and toy shows, alongside a couple of other personal favorite vintage toy lines were WWF Hasbro figures, and any chance I get, I'll always scoop up some WWF Hasbro figures. And that brings us to the figures that I've got here in front of me that I'll take you through. And the way I will do this is I'll start from the earlier ones. The first figures that I've got here are Series 2 figures, which was 1991. And then I'll work my way through to the later figures. And I'll try to keep this fairly quick because I do want to do my best to keep my videos to 10-15 minutes or less. Now, first we start with the Series 2 1991 Honky Tonk Man figure. Now, the Honky Tonk Man, again, a wrestler that's very much reflective of this period. He's got the Elvis impersonator gimmick. He's very colorful, very cartoony. And to me, this figure captures that very well. He's got the garish outfit, the iconic hair. This figure came with an excellent guitar accessory, which I have somewhere that I picked up in a bulk lot somewhere. So I've got to reunite Honky with his guitar. Honky Tonk Man's action feature is this slamming motion, which again will work very well with guitar in hand. But again, just a great figure. A figure that's in very good condition, still held a lot of his color, and I'm really happy to have this guy in my collection. Now, during that same series of WWF Hasbro figures, several double packs of various tag teams were released. One of them was the Rockers. Here I have the Shawn Michaels Rocker figure. I've got the Marty Jannetty somewhere, so I wanted to pick this figure up to complete that tag team. He's in fairly good condition. But one thing that was notable with these WWF Hasbro figures is some of them had good play poses or good stances, some of them had terrible ones. Now this Shawn Michaels figure has a bizarre sort of lump on his back, which I guess is used as a handle to send him flying off the top rope, which in the case of the Rockers is rather fitting. But for me, I was never a huge fan of this. In any case, this was a figure I had as a kid, and this was around about the time when Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty went their separate ways. And Shawn Michaels went from the high-flying, fun-loving rocker to the Heartbreak Kid gimmick, which propelled him to superstar status. And as we all know, this came about when Shawn Michaels super kicked Marty Jannetty through the glass of Brutus the Barber Beefcake's barbershop show. This was a time when these vignettes, these talking head shows were a big part of the WWF product, and to me that was a very iconic scene and a very memorable one to this day. Next we move on to another figure that was released as part of a tag team double pack, and that is Bushwhacker Butch. Now I've got fond memories of the Bushwhackers as a kid. They were never, to my recollection, competing for the titles, but as far as a mid-card tag team providing amazing comic relief, fantastic audience interaction, and really iconic visuals like, you know, the arm movement entrance and licking one another and licking audience members, these guys certainly added a lot of fun to the WWF in the early 90s. Now the action figure for Butch here is this stomping foot motion. This was one of the original figures that I inherited from my cousin. I've got Luke somewhere, so once again, happy to make the Bushwhackers complete. Next we move from Series 2 to Series 3, which were released in 1992. And the first Series 3 figure that I have here is the Earthquake figure. Now Earthquake was initially a singles competitor, first billed as the Canadian Earthquake, as that monster heel, but then he obviously dropped the Canadian and became Earthquake, and in time he partnered with Typhoon, formerly billed as Tugboat in quite a bizarre gimmick at the time, even for that time, but partnering with Typhoon, Earthquake became the Natural Disasters. Now, although these figures were both released individually, we have Typhoon in his Natural Disasters outfit, and I personally would have preferred an Earthquake in his Natural Disasters sort of matching outfit, because to me this is how I remember them. I remember them as a tag team, you know, both wearing their matching red, white and black outfits and, you know, feuding with the likes of the Legion of Doom, the Nasty Boys and so on. Next we move from Series 3 to Series 4, also released during 1992, with a tag team that competed heavily with the Natural Disasters during the period that I was most obsessed with wrestling, and that is the Legion of Doom with Hawk and Animal. Now, these guys were my absolute favorite tag team as a kid. With that said, I didn't have these figures when I was a kid. They were on every Christmas and birthday wish list, but they weren't destined to make it into my collection until I was an adult. But like I said, my favorite tag team as a kid, I remember fondly their battles with the Nasty Boys and also the Natural Disasters, like I mentioned. When I was lucky enough to get 2 pet mice as a kid, their names were a no-brainer. They were Hawk and Animal. So not only did we have 2 fantastic wrestlers, you know, a great tag team, but we also have 2 really good figures here. Very, very good representations of their outfits and face paint, which I understand borrowed from the film Mad Max at the time. Animal here has an excellent play pose, fantastic detail in the face sculpt. Hawk, again, great facial expression. He's got this fused leg, spring-loaded back feature that I wasn't always a huge fan of, but in the case of the Legion of Doom, I think it does make a little bit of sense, because obviously their iconic finishing maneuver was the Doomsday Device, which had Hawk on the top rope, an unfortunate victim on Animal's shoulders, taken out by Hawk as he jumped off the top rope. So again, very fond memories of these guys and really happy to have them in my collection, you know, after I first wanted them, 30 years ago. So happy with these guys. Also released during Series 4 of 1992 was the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Now, to me, this is a great representation of the British Bulldog. You've got the powerhouse physique, the great Union Jack details on his trunks, the braids captured well. Now, my memories of the British Bulldog were after he'd gone his separate ways from the Dynamite Kid, you know, when they competed as the tag team, the British Bulldogs, into the singles competitor, where he won the Intercontinental title from Bret Hart and he feuded with the likes of the Warlord and Mr. Perfect. So, you know, fond memories of the British Bulldog, and again, very happy to have this figure in my collection. Next, we fast forward from Series 4 all the way to Series 8 with another figure that I'm really happy to get my hands on, and that's this 1994 Yokozuna figure. Now, a lot of these WWF Hasbro figures feature reused molds and reused parts, but when it comes to Yokozuna, how could he have possibly been made from another mold, even from another big man like the Earthquake, or before the Earthquake, Andre the Giant, who I'm sure we'll look at some stage soon. So I'm really happy that Hasbro went all out with a unique mold and design just for Yokozuna. I think it's a fantastic capture of Yoko, of his size and scale. And once again, I'm really happy to have it in my collection. And this was released around about the time when Yokozuna won the 1993 Royal Rumble, and he went on that run where he won the WWF title from Bret Hart at WrestleMania 9, only to lose it minutes later to Hulk Hogan. And then, you know, we obviously had the Body Slam Challenge where Lex Luger slammed him, and that triggered another feud, and then he went on to feud with The Undertaker. This is a guy whose in-ring work might not have been amazing on account of his sheer size, but his presence was one that I remember fondly, whether he was a heel or whether he was a face. So again, very happy to have this guy in my collection. Finally, we go from Series 8 to Series 9, which was also released in 1994, with another great figure, and that is this Hacksaw Jim Duggan figure. Now, by the time I became really invested in the WWF and in wrestling, Hacksaw Jim Duggan was somewhat of a mid-tier competitor, but I do remember fondly the Patriot gimmick, you know, the 2x4. Now, this figure has excellent detail. He's got the stars and stripes on the back of his singlet. He comes with a great and very fitting accessory in this American flag. You can see that the mold has been reused from the earlier Hacksaw figure because he's got a perfectly molded hand to fit the 2x4 accessory, which this figure doesn't come with, but the prior Hacksaw Jim Duggan figure came with. So again, even though this figure didn't come with the 2x4, I'm gonna have to try and get my hands on it because that hand doesn't quite look complete, and Hacksaw himself doesn't quite look complete without the 2x4 in hand. But look, regardless, a very cool figure, lots of detail, and a figure that's in fantastic condition for its age. So again, really happy to have this one as well. And finally, we finish with one last 1994 Series 9 release, and that is Doink the Clown. Now, this was another figure that I had as a child. He was a 1994 Christmas present, I believe. But like all the other Hasbros, he was sold off in a garage sale. So once again, happy to have this figure back in my collection. But, you know, Doink was a wrestler that was very much reflective of this early 90s gimmick-heavy period of wrestling. And this figure reflects that really well. You know, his facial expression and his pose here is almost like a miming clown. And Doink was known to play pranks on other wrestlers, notably Crush and the Big Boss Man, and provide that comic relief from coming from an evil heel character. So again, yeah, happy to have this guy. And that's it, guys. Just wanted to share with you my most recent pickups of a vintage toy line that was very close to my heart, both as a kid and also as an adult collector. And if you happen to be a Hasbro WWF fan or enthusiast or collector, whether it was in your childhood or nowadays, I'd love to hear from you in the comments and hear your stories and hear what your favorites are or what your least favorites are. And that's it, guys. If you've been watching, thank you very much. I appreciate your support, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.